Bill Handel had a relatively bland childhood. Or so it felt at the time. He grew up in a nondescript little house in the suburbs. He was homeschooled. Bill liked playing catch with his dad. He liked baking cookies with his mom. He loved to watch crime documentaries on TV. It was his parents who had watched them initially, but then Bill became obsessed. When they felt that Bill was old enough, his parents sat him down and explained that they were secret agents for a place called the DRO. He had been homeschooled because they were afraid that someone might be watching them, and they always had to be careful. After that eye-opening conversation, Bill was given a lot more autonomy in his life. More trips to the park, bike rides by himself, even going to video arcades so that he could spend some time with kids his own age. He knew that he must be careful and always watch out for people who might be watching him. When Bill was 13, he asked his parents to be able to go to public high school. They said they would discuss it. After they thought Bill was asleep, they made a phone call. This was in the early 80s, mind you, when phones had multiple extensions connected to the same landline. So Bill quietly picked up one of the other extensions and listened in as his parents told some man, what Bill had asked them. And then they asked this man what they should do. The man considered it for a moment and then said, "Sure, let's try it." Bill didn't say anything to his parents, but he did start to watch them, paying attention to the smallest details, trying to uncover what they were hiding. Who were they answering to, and why were they answering to anyone? If they were secret agents, as they claimed, then they traded in secrets and lies. So what else weren't they telling Bill? As for public high school, it went very well. Bill excelled in academics and proved to be somewhat athletic as well, although he was a little thin. He had a very hard time making friends, but a very easy time blending in. It was also around this time he started to think there might be something wrong with him. Contrary to what he had been taught to expect and what he had seen in movies and TV, the comely young high school girls did nothing for him. He found himself drawn to the handsome football players, the big beefy boys. It's very common for teenage boys, or all teenagers, to be confused as to who they are, to think the world is lying to them, to think they are different from everyone else. And this was compounded in Bill because he knew that the world was lying to him. Ultimately, he had no one else to talk to, so he broke down and talked to his parents. He told them that he was different from other boys. His dad asked, "Do you want to kill people?" What? What? No. No, why would you? No. I mean, I like boys. His father shrugged. That's all? You're just a homosexual? So what? His mother cut in. Do you ever think about doing bad things to those boys? Hurting them? No, of course not. What the fuck kind of question is that, Mom? Bill walked away more confused than ever. His parents made another phone call that night. Once again, Bill listened in. After they went to bed, he called the operator and had her redial the last outgoing number. She told him that the number was restricted, and he said to her sharply, "Just put the boss on. Tell him that I know." There was a series of connections and clicks, a long silence, and then a familiar voice came on the other end of the line. "Hello, Bill," the man said. "I assume you have questions." "Yes, I do." "Let's meet in person, and I will tell you everything you want to know. Probably a lot more than you're ready to know." Bill was a little taken aback. You will? Just like that?" "Sure, why not?" "You're not giving us any actionable data, little guy. The director's office is haranguing me to pull the plug, so yeah, get one of those idiots upstairs to drive you in." "You mean my parents?" "They're not your parents, Bill. They're my agents, assigned to raise you. It's all part of the experiment. You'll understand soon enough." Bill didn't know what he had been expecting from this call, but he certainly was not expecting this. I just tell them to drive me to you. Tell them Jonestown said it's time to come home. They won't question you." The man hung up, and thus ended the relatively bland childhood of Bill Handel and started him on his life of death. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. Music, monsters, and mayhem, killers, cannibals, and cults, fearful fiction and furious fact, tall tales, and terrible truths. This is a scary home companion. In a suite of surveillance rooms and laboratories hidden behind a crumbling brick storefront, the DRO agent, known only as Jonestown, sipped his coffee and explained Bill Handel's unique background. Although his tone was clipped and oftentimes annoyed, there was something about his bluntness that Bill found refreshing. For once, he wasn't being mollycoddled. The agent said, "We started the Code Crimson experiments to see how we could manipulate and weaponize existing serial killers. They were already out there killing. Why not harness that resource? This here was just a side project. I'm fascinated by genetics. We wanted to see if we could build our own human monsters, design our own weapons. Before we could understand how to properly use such an idea, we needed a first wave, and that first wave needed a baseline. Of all of these subjects, we needed one genetic time bomb of mass murder to be raised in a completely neutral environment. There were some prompts along the way, of course, but for the most part, we let you develop on your own. And let me say that you are a supreme disappointment, Bill. You come from donor sperm and donor egg, harvested from the most sadistic death row psychopaths that we could find. You were matured in a living womb at first, then transferred to an artificial one to finish. Upon birth, you were immediately placed into the care of my agents. And all of this for what? You're well-adjusted, confident, articulate. By any measuring stick, you're a good kid, Bill. But I didn't want a good kid. For the others, we used variants on precipitating trauma to jumpstart them. And that seemed to work well enough. You were the baseline, so I guess you taught us what we needed to know. That genetics alone isn't enough. Bill tried to soak it all in. So what happens now? Jonestown leaned back in his seat and steepled his fingers. I move on to another experiment. What happens to me now? And the silence from the agent was deafening. It was chilling. It was 6 feet deep. Bill broke the silence. Let me work for you. And Jonestown laughed. No, wait, hear me out. Not now. I'm no good to you now, I know that. No one knows me better than you. You know I have potential. Let me finish school. I'll go to college, I'll study whatever you say I need to study. Genetics, law enforcement, psychology. I read all of these things anyway. You know this. Make me ready. Then I come and I work here. I work for you, and you know that I'll be loyal. Bill, I'm not your dad. I made you, but you're not mine. I don't want a dad. I know that you don't care about me, and I don't care about you either, but you think this project was a bust. What if the product of this experiment, this project, went on to become an ace DRO agent? How does the experiment look then? How do you look? The man's face softened. He thought about it. He knew the director's office wanted nothing more than tangible, useful results. And this boy could prove useful. And so he did. For the next 2 years, Bill lived in a DRO safe house, all by himself. He graduated early and applied to one school, the one that was closest to the DRO branch office where Jonestown was working from. It also wasn't very far from Quantico, so while Bill took his college coursework in law enforcement and criminal psychology, he also took FBI training courses. Although the two men spoke rarely, they stayed in contact. The agent sent money, and the student stayed focused and took direction as it was given. Once Jonestown asked if Bill wanted to know who his genetic parents were. He teased. You'd recognize the names. They've been on the true crime shows that you like so much. Bill said no. He asked to never be told who they were. He wouldn't expound upon that to his mentor, but inwardly, it was because he didn't want the knowledge of his heritage to burden him. He came from bad blood, he knew that. But he was his own man, his own person, a blank slate, tabula rasa. And he wanted to build the foundation for his future based solely on his experience. The way he saw it, knowing who provided the genetic material to create him, offered no positives, only negatives. Genetics alone isn't enough. After that, Jonestown never brought it up again. Bill was a quiet man, well-liked, but not well-known. Not quite mousy, but he didn't exactly command a room. He was good-looking, in a forgettable way, and amusing, without ever being actually funny. Jonestown had long advised him they should know you, but not remember you. And Bill lived this. For Bill, it was remarkably easy to live that way. Although he wasn't a madman, he wasn't delusional, he wasn't psychotic, he did have the touch of the sociopath about him. And just as he was liked but not loved, he liked people well enough, but rarely ever felt connected to them. He was swimming in an ocean, and yet a unique species, all his own. He might have looked like everyone else, but Bill wasn't like everyone else. By 1992, Bill was 23 years old and starting out with his first assignment as a DRO field agent. He had been assigned to the Helping Hand program. Jonestown gave him the posting in person, along with a glass of scotch. He told Bill that this was a dangerous assignment, but an important one. He was going to be watching over a test subject with a potentially bright future, a man named Danny Miller. Danny was a very special individual, and the DRO had been studying him as he roamed the country with his best friend, a professional arsonist. Danny was the first person to have the Code Crimson status assigned to him, which meant that no matter where he went, law enforcement could not touch him. Danny was a lunatic who possessed a stunning propensity for violence, and now Bill was going to be his personal handler. As it turned out, he and Danny got on quite well. They had a lot in common aside from killing people. Be it his nature or his upbringing, Bill Handel possessed a certain moral flexibility that made him the ideal DRO agent. He was not a cruel person. In fact, in his day-to-day life, he was quite kind. But his inability to connect with other humans gave him a very valuable emotional distance. He could witness, experience horrible things, and not let it affect him personally. After all, people died all the time. If people died around him, or even in his presence, that made those deaths no more tragic than the thousands of other deaths that happened on any given day. Just as he had promised as a teenager, Bill was proving to be an exceptional agent and an asset for Deep Red Ops. With Jonestown as his rabbi, the sky was the limit. By 1996, on his 27th birthday, Bill was promoted to special agent and given a very important assignment that would change the course of his life. He was paired up with a priest named Frank Rourke. Bill Handel was a golden boy, a prodigy, the youngest special agent the DRO had ever fielded. The backing of Jonestown had opened doors for him, but Bill made his own way based on his performance and his cool under pressure. It didn't hurt at all that he was one of the DRO's most politic and discreet agents. They started to use him heavily as a liaison between projects and offices, a job that was much more complicated than it might seem. The deeper Bill got into the DRO, the more he understood that it didn't work like a standard government department. It was structured more like a terrorist organization, with dozens of different cells that operated independently. They all answered to the same director's office, but contact between the different cells was very minimal. Bill went a lot of places, met a lot of people. He always kept detailed mental notes about every single person that he met, that he talked to. He had designs on the future, and remembering names and faces would be important to that end. Near the end of that year, Bill lost a mentor and gained a partner. Jonestown was just getting settled into his new suite of labs at the newly constructed Black Site 1. He informed Bill quite coldly that they would likely never see each other again, and wished him well. Soon after, Bill was tasked with working with the priest, Frank Rourke. After the global bloodbath they called the Campaign, this paramilitary religious order had started reaching out to form a working relationship with the DRO. They had enemies in common, so it made sense to share resources. On a personal level, the two men really gelled. And perhaps it was the timing of having Jonestown literally descend into madness and leaving a void in his life, but Bill didn't think it was that. Because Rourke was a very different kind of man than Jonestown. About the same age, about 20 years older than Bill, but he had a kindly way of speaking and soft eyes. He was worldly and hardened, yet still optimistic. This was a man who came from violence, but seemed to genuinely want to make the world a better place. Frank Rourke was part troubled Vietnam vet and part Ned Flanders. Bill found himself becoming quite fond of the man, beyond his purview as a liaison. The first case that Handel and Rourke worked together involved the anthropologist, Neil Wallace. Dr. Wallace had brutally slaughtered his family in connection with an ancient deity. And then he disappeared. He went elsewhere to continue his work. Wallace called himself a haruspex. Bill was not intended to catch Neil Wallace. He was sent to study him to see A, what his greater purpose was, and B, if that purpose could benefit the DRO in any way. Much to his surprise, Rourke was also not intended to catch the haruspex. Both men had been sent to watch this killer, to see where his dark path was taking him, but not to interfere. This weighed heavily on Rourke's conscience. Not so much Bill's, due to his aforementioned moral flexibility, but it was directly because of that quality that he found something comforting in Rourke's sympathy pains. It was something that Bill had never seen very much of in his entire life: genuine compassion. If the goal of this working relationship between the DRO and the Order was building bridges, then the first one was constructed in 1998. Bill was approached by an agent who went by the name of Lefty. After doing some wet work for Jonestown, the older agent had gotten her into the department. Bill remembered her. Jonestown had told him that she was a steady hand and very smart. So when Lefty pitched a somewhat radical idea to Bill, he listened. She had been studying the work of a 3-sniper unit called the Vespers. They worked as soldiers, killers for the Order, and their techniques were revolutionary. Lefty wanted to train with the Vespers and then use what she learned to set up a sniper training program for the DRO. It could potentially give Deep Red Ops the best shooters in the world. And it was a good fucking idea. It benefited the department. It strengthened the relationship between the two organizations. With the help of Rourke, Bill got Lefty some field time with the Vespers. Rourke then went the extra step. He got the whole DRO sniper program off the ground by having the Vespers themselves come in and train the first wave of snipers. Bill was honest. He was upfront with Lefty. He said, "I'm going to take credit for this idea. Trust me, I will take care of you on the back end." Like Jonestown had been his rabbi, Bill decided that when the time came, he would look out for this woman. Now that he was inside the DRO, learning how it worked, learning its top operators, he was starting to think about the best way to advance, to climb to the top. He had no intention of remaining an employee for the rest of his life. He wanted to be the boss. And if he wanted to be in the director's office, then he would need smart, capable people who he could trust, or who owed him. Of course, owing people goes both ways. Bill got a lesson in that a year later when Rourke called in the favor that he earned for helping set up that sniper program. They were in Philadelphia, a branch office for the DRO that had turned into a carnal house. 13 dead agents. The conference room and the office suite had been turned into a dark chapel. Sacrifices of meat and blood splayed out around a cursed painting mounted on the wall. The DRO had confiscated a legendary piece of art called the Ravenous One. And somehow its evil had infected the field office. There was still one agent unaccounted for, which was Bill's focus. He wanted to get the full story, but Rourke had a different idea. He said, "What we need to do is get the painting somewhere safe." The priest briefly told Bill the horrid and bloody history of this painting. No matter where that missing agent was, the real priority was taking the painting out of circulation so that it would stop causing this sort of carnage. Bill said no. So Rourke called in his favor. "You owe me." Were it anybody else, anybody aside from Jonestown perhaps, Bill would have told him to fuck off. The job was the job. But this was different. Bill wasn't used to feeling this way, but he realized he didn't want the older man to think any less of him, so he felt compelled to act with honor. A favor is a favor, but a favor only goes so far. If he was going to let this dangerous painting go, he needed to know that it was going someplace secure. Rourke took him to the fortress, which is what they called the Old Church on the shore of Grand Bahama Island. It served as the HQ for the Order. Handel and Rourke went deep under the fortress, to the vault in the stone caves below. The priest showed the agent all of the horrible trophies the Order had collected over the centuries. Hermetically sealed bodies, forbidden texts, cursed weapons, and hundreds of black, oozing slugs in glass jars. Living brain tumors. Bill knew that the DRO had been studying them for decades. He didn't know that there were this many. To see all of them here in one place made Bill understand that the crusade the Order was fighting was a lot more real than he had previously believed. It helped him understand the gravity of what they were working for and against. Bill left the painting in the vault, where it stayed locked up for almost 20 years. Eventually, the time came to bring in the Haruspecs. The director's office decided they had learned everything that they could learn about him while roaming free. They needed him in captivity. Using the information gathered from two teenage boys who had managed to survive the madman's violence, Bill Handel and Frank Rourke captured Neil Wallace and delivered him to one of the DRO's many black site holding facilities. During this period, Bill still worked many other assignments for the DRO. His pairing with Rourke was just for major cases, so they would spend weeks on end together and then not see each other at all for several months. It was always the death that dictated their time together. And so it was in 2002 when they reunited once again in the aftermath of the tragedy of the trapdoor spider. In a cave system underneath Bob Wire's barbed wire emporium was a spider's web of wire and razors. Dozens of first responders had fallen through trap doors in the sand above and gotten wrapped in the deadly web. Rourke believed that even worse horrors had occurred down below, but he wouldn't say what those were. Bill combed the wreckage, assessed the dead, walked the scene, and spoke to all survivors. One of the survivors was a man named Keyshawn Turner, a former Green Beret and field medic. Keyshawn was now a part-time EMT that had the bad luck to be working when the call came in. Instead of plummeting to his death or getting shredded to pieces by razor wire like so many of his cohorts, Keyshawn had gotten his leg wrapped in barbed wire. It had saved his life from the fall, but ultimately cost him his leg, which had to be amputated just above the knee. He told Bill that while hanging there, clinging to consciousness, he'd seen a man down below, clutching a book and running away. He also said that Bill was boyishly handsome and asked if he was single. No one had ever asked Bill that before, so he didn't know what to say. He just turned around and walked out of the room. The next morning, Keyshawn woke up to an arrangement of flowers by his bedside. Instead of a get well card was a business card. Bill's name and number, with a little handwritten note on the back saying, "This is going to say the number is disconnected, but leave a message anyway." Against all logic, Keyshawn called him. and they started to date. Infrequently, of course, because more than anything, Bill was a man consumed by his work. In particular, a new case had caught his attention. Rourke had actually brought it to him. The Order was interested, very interested, in an old Southern legend about a ghostly hitchhiker. What was his connection to the serial killer who had been plaguing the roads for the last decade? Rourke believed that this man might be an emissary. That was what the Order called those slugs nestled in people's brains. And that as an emissary, the Southern gentleman was maintaining the same MO over time while moving bodies. In 2003, Bill saw the Southern gentleman in the flesh for the first time. It was in a truck stop about 10 miles south of Short Nap, Georgia. He immediately called for a tactical team, and that proved to be jumping the gun. Bill had underestimated the gentleman, had assumed that he was just a madman. Then, that hijacked tanker truck had smashed into the tactical unit's armored transport. Bill was in a follow car, which had been upended and split open in the violent explosion of the accident. He sustained fairly serious head trauma, but was still cognizant enough to climb out of the car and survey the damage. 7 agents, and what ended up being 6 more civilians, were dead from a blast that was almost too big and too public for the DRO to cover up. Most troubling of all was the disembodied farewell message that drifted over the CB channels.
Better luck next time, Billy boy.
The gentleman mocked him before whistling, "A country boy will survive," until Bill shot the fucking radio and then fell unconscious. He stayed that way for 3 full days. When he awoke, Bill was in a DRO medical facility. Rourke was with him, and so was Keyshawn. Since his injury, Keyshawn had become an RN. Rourke had arranged for him to be hired as Bill's private nurse. It was a very sweet gesture, one born from love and affection, one that Bill didn't fully understand at the time. 2 years later, Bill and Keyshawn were married in a private ceremony in front of a handful of Keyshawn's family and war buddies. Their union was officiated by Father Frank Rourke. And it was only then, after the husband had been kissed and the rice had been thrown, that Bill was finally able to say thank you to his friend. Love is good and all, but the work goes on. In 2005, a new director sought to revive and refine the Helping Hand program. Because of his prior experience, Bill was brought in as the primary field agent. He studied, recruited, and field tested potential DRO assets. They weren't looking for wild dogs. They needed controllable and versatile weapons. Bill had great success with the case of Dr. Catharsis. Ivy Williams was really quite brilliant, and Bill felt her research could benefit any number of ongoing projects. Once Ivy got past her anger issues, she became a model agent. But the successes were few and far between. More common were cases like Miss Mercy, who, as with most wild dogs, didn't take kindly to a collar and leash. In 2009, there was a new rash of sightings and murders attributed to the Southern gentleman. Bill felt compelled to go settle accounts. Keyshawn asked him not to go. Bill explained as best he could that he didn't want to send more agents. That's what he did last time, and he still carried the weight of those dead men on his back. He had never been good at understanding or explaining his emotions, so he couldn't cast it into words. But he felt no choice but to go and take care of this business personally. Keyshawn said, "You sounded like Francis just there. It suits you. Well, if you're going off to do the stupid right thing like a goddamn idiot, the least you could do is take Francis with you." To everyone else, he was brother or father or Frank or Rourke. Only Keyshawn called him Francis. And that was how Bill and Rourke ended up driving alone down a 2-lane highway in East Louisiana on that fateful night. By this point, Rourke and the Order no longer believed that the gentleman had any connection to the island that they crusaded against. He was not an emissary. They didn't know what he was. Nonetheless, when Bill called for a shotgun, Frank came, no questions asked. For the second time, Bill had underestimated the gentleman. As they drove, the killer reached out to Bill over the CD, calling him out personally. And the agent answered the call. Somehow, the Southern gentleman already knew that Bill was coming for him, and he was ready. In the middle of their back and forth banter, Bill didn't see the car that was racing towards them in the dark with the running lights out until it was far too late. In that last half a second, right before impact, time seemed to slow down. Bill locked eyes with the Southern gentleman through the windshields, just feet apart. Wham! Everything went black. It took weeks before he was healed enough to walk, talk, eat, shit, and get chewed out by his husband. But Bill was finally told in no uncertain terms that Keyshawn would not be nursing him back to health a third time. "You're not a soldier," he scolded him. "This is not a war." Bill took that to heart. He pondered it over the next few days, until he had come away with a revision to his plan, because Keyshawn had been both right and wrong. He was wrong because this was a war for the director's office. And he was right because Bill was not a soldier. Bill was a general, and he needed soldiers. By the time Bill Handel was ready to go back to work, he was ready to enter the next phase in his life of death. Thank you for listening to another episode of A Scary Home Companion. Find the show on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Email us directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. Or support the show on our Patreon. Better yet, you can do all three. Normally, this is where the credits go. But there aren't credits this time because this story isn't done yet. The next episode in the life of death of Bill Handel is coming soon.